Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Strategic Organization Design Trends. What is the right organization design? You should be seeing a viewing window on the left of your screen, and the control panel should be on the right. Under the View option, you can make selections on what you would like to see. Reed will be sharing his webcam. If you find that the transmission is lagging sometimes turning off the webcam view can help with that. All attendees today will be muted, and so please ask your questions via the question box on the control panel, and Reed will do his best to answer those as we go through today's presentation. You can collapse the control panel by using the orange arrow at the upper left of the panel. If you would like to receive SHRM PDCs for participating in the webcast today, please make sure that you complete the survey that will launch once we've ended the webinar. If you have any difficulty with this, go ahead and email me, Bonnie Saxey. Just reply to the reminder email that was sent to you. And then lastly, the slides for today's webinar and the recording will be available early next week, and we will send you an email with the direct links to those. So, Reed.
Thank you, and hello to everyone. Thank you for joining today. Really excited for today's discussion, and I hope that as we go that people will chime in with questions and comments. I know it's hard in this setting to do that real time, but if you'll type in your questions, I'll do my best to respond to those as we go. Now, the reason I'm so excited for this topic is because as we get ready to close out 2017 and head into a new year, you know, I think a lot of us in the field and just frankly out in the organizations that we work in are confronted with questions like, well, what's next, and how are all the different trends and issues that we're reading about and that we're feeling in our organizations going to impact our organization. So I'd like to spend some time on that subject today. For those that are not as familiar with AlignOrg Solutions and what we do, I'd like to just kind of introduce our work and our specialization. We do work in the area of organization design for sure. That's sort of our bread and butter. And around that, we help organizations clarify their strategic positioning. We help them diagnose the capabilities in their organization and how effectively they're set up to compete. And then we help with organizations as they try to implement change and affect the improvements that they're looking to do in their organization. The other thing that we do, in addition to our consulting work, which allows us to be able to get inside of organizations and see how things work and to practice and try all of the different things that we talk about in these webinars, is we do a lot of capability building in the hopes of building a cadre of professionals out there that are familiar with and comfortable with the topics and tools and frameworks related to the profession of organization transformation in a broad sense. And so that's a large part of what we do as an organization. Now today in our webinar, you know, we'll refer to various organizations that some of which we've had the chance to work with, some of which we all read about and see in the news. These organizations are ones that are trying to solve for the kinds of issues and challenges that we'll be talking about today. You know, how do you digitize an organization? How do you adopt agile work principles and things of that nature? And so you're probably in like organizations that are trying to wrestle with similar questions. And so hopefully we'll have some stories and case studies from these and other organizations that will help us unpack these issues. So let's dive into our agenda for today. There's sort of three big questions or themes that we're seeing confront organizations. About a month ago, I was in the conference board, and we were having our two-day organization design conference, and at that session, we saw these topics come up quite a bit. And so let me kind of highlight the ones that I'd like to spend time on today. I recognize that in just a 45-minute to an hour broadcast, we can't get through every possible theme or trend that is going on. But if you've got questions or you're seeing a different theme or trend that is impacting your organization, feel free to shoot me an email or send a question in, and we'll do our best to try to dive into that as well, because All of these things, require us to think sometimes a little differently about how we approach organization change. Three topics that or trends that we're seeing that are really shaping the way organizations are working. The first is really how will agile ways of working continue to transform how organizations innovate and deliver value. That's a topic that throughout the entire year this year we've been trying to cover. We had a whole separate webinar on agile organization design. We put out a guide on how to think about that same topic. So I want to explore that just a little bit further as it pertains to how organizations are looking at adopting agile principles, not just for organization design and transformation, but throughout their organization as a way of working to shape culture and improve the way the organization delivers results. The second big topic is, as no surprise to probably anyone on this session today, is what is going on with digital transformation, and what does that mean for competitive strategy and the design of traditional organization capabilities and functions. It feels like a big rock. It feels like when that rock drops in the pond, it's leaving a lot of ripple effects. There's a lot of talk about it. It's going to require a lot of investment and new ways of thinking, and so I'd like to sort of get into that subject a little bit as well and see how that might be able to inform our thinking as we go into the new year. And then finally, recently, a month or two ago, we did a discussion on virtual connected organizations. And that was a follow-up really from a webinar we did, I believe, in late 2016 that dealt with platform business models. But what we're seeing, obviously, is a trend toward much more virtual organizations being created to deliver value, and how that is an innovative way to leverage resources and expertise. But it comes with some complexity and some new ways of how you govern and control those organizations. And so we want to talk about those impacts as well. So those are the three major themes that we want to dive into in some depth today. So without further ado, let's dive into the topic of agile and agile ways of working. Most of us are familiar with the idea of Scrum. Scrum, of course, is a term that's picked up from the game of rugby that applies to the image that you're seeing now on the screen, which is the players from the opposing teams come together, they lock arms, and they work in a very concerted manner to try to sort of regain possession of the ball and begin to move the ball down the field to score a try. And in a very similar way, Agile is all about bringing the right people together in an organization to work in a very concentrated and focused way to be able to accomplish some sort of business objective. And the reason that Agile is getting so much attention, I believe, is that Agile does a couple of things. One of them is that it tries to concentrate energy into short bursts where innovation, creativity, and work can happen in an accelerated way, and that progress and performance can be increased. In fact, there are some studies now that are showing that work that's done, like software development or product development, that's being done in agile ways are producing productivity gains as high as 300%. Now that seems pretty extreme, but what that really is saying is that instead of seeing, say, a software development cycle that might last months, 9, 12, 15, 18 months, we're now seeing some cycles being as quick as a few weeks or maybe a month or two, which is a pretty substantial productivity increase. Another reason why we're seeing a lot of uptick in agile ways of working is because it's about bringing the right talent together to co-create a solution that's better than any one department or group could on their own create. And so it's really about trying to unleash the best thinking and talent and to generate the insights that are going to create competitive breakthroughs. And the third thing that is appealing, I think, for folks and organizations is that Agile is pushing on traditional organization designs and structures. And it's saying, look, we need more adaptive and flexible ways to work together. How do we share resources? How do we move things around in the organization? How do we mobilize to get something done and then disband and move on to the next thing that is important? And so these are the reasons why Agile is getting, so much attention, I believe. And what we're seeing in a lot of organizations is that, yes, the whole Agile movement started in software because, folks were trying to say, how do we do this better? Every time, one of the biggest knocks we saw on software development in the past was that it took months to do, if not years. And when we finally launched the solution, it seemed to be wrong. It was outdated, it had missed key requirements, or something in the meantime had changed that, the development process was unable to accommodate. And so Agile is really an attempt to respond to those dynamics and say, is there a better way for us to do this work and get better outcomes? Well, as software development has improved and we're seeing more rapid cycles and better deliverables coming out of that space, people are asking the same question, can't we do this in product development? Or can't we do this in even organization design or organization transformation? And so organizations now are asking the question, can we change our culture to now start to adopt some of the principles that Agile software development is based upon? In other words, can we figure out ways to concentrate our energy as an organization on the critical few things and knock them out rather than having them last for an entire year or a multi-year planning horizon? Is there a way to really pull talent and thinking from across the entire organization to unleash some of the best thinking and creative insights? If you think about some of the large organizations out there, a few years back, we did some work with one of the large technology firms in Silicon Valley. And one of the things that they were trying to do was to figure out how do they tap into their 85,000 plus employees, because they were making so many external hires to bring folks in that they thought were good and talented to address strategic needs. And they said, we've got 85,000 people in our organization that are probably already some of the best and brightest people, but we don't unleash them. We don't pull them forward to work together on the right things at the right time. And so those types of organizations are now asking the question, can we adopt Agile as a way of working? So when we look at doing an organization transformation, for example, we're looking at them now in terms of how do we break them down into iterations, because Agile is about trying to take a discrete piece of work and break it down into an iteration where we can work an issue, come forward with a recommendation or an answer, vet that with the organization and put it into practice, and then repeat as needed. And so we would rather do multiple iterations if we can move and accelerate the pace of change. And that's the way organizations are wanting to work. The way we see that play out is you have to have a clear owner for whatever it is you're trying to produce that's got clarity around what's the vision and what are the features we're trying to produce. Let's bring the right people together, of course, and then let's get somebody who can facilitate and guide this group to accomplish the key deliverables in what we refer to as a sprint. When we see this happen in an organizational context around any other body of work, like an organizational transformation or even product development or a project even, what we're now starting to see is let's identify our sponsor, let's lay out a clear strategy, let's have some guardrails or design criteria, let's get somebody in charge of facilitating the work of this team, and then let's get them into intense work sessions so that we can get the work accomplished in a more accelerated fashion. This all tees up a challenge that is important, which is, and this is a very busy slide, but I want to sort of talk this through. Inside of organizations, there are multiple systems that exist that govern how work is done. There's a strategic system that sets direction and priority and addresses major risks to an enterprise. They make trade-offs among resources. They evaluate fit in the marketplace. Then there's a coordinating system that tends to operate mostly inside of the organization, and it translates the strategy into more tactical and operational activities, and it moves resources and equipment and tools and people around to get things done and to execute on the strategic objectives. And then there's the operating system. These are the people and the tools, the resources that get stuff done, the real work. Now, the reason I'm putting this forward is that if an organization is trying to adopt more agile ways of working, there's going to have to be some shifts in the way the organization governs work. In a more traditional way of working, we can get away with an annual strategic planning process where we sit down on an annual basis and we lay out our strategic plans. We roll those out into objectives and plans by quarter or by month into our annual operating plans. Then the coordinating system can kick in and we can start to shift resources around, move resources, get work done, prioritize initiatives, work on projects that are going to move us forward, and then we can work on the daily activities in the operating system. When you move to an agile way of working, that cycle has to run a lot quicker, and you're often much more comfortable with what we refer to in agile as minimally viable products coming out of your work efforts, which means that it might feel like a beta or it might feel like a first generation outcome. But the reason you do that is so that you can then assess, get value, put it into place, and start operating with that innovation. And now you can start to move and decide, is there further innovation or enhancement you need to do to that? And so the governance system in an agile organization has to change pretty considerably. You have to train people. You have to put in place ways to report on and track the work that's being done in these intensive iterations and work sprints. Now, questions come in here in terms of, does this trend matter if an organization is working toward innovation? The answer is yes and no. Obviously, agile and agile ways of working is a great fit for innovative work like product development, even software development, where you're creating, you're designing, and you're bringing talent together. It's not always a great way to run, traditional operations like a manufacturing line or a customer service center or something where there's repetitiveness and predictability and you want consistency over time, in the work. So you do have to be selective about when agile practices fit, but when organizations are looking at agile as a way to change and influence their culture, they're really looking for the ways that agile can enhance decision making, the ways that agile thinking can accelerate projects and work, and also to try to bring the right people together to look at things cross-functionally. So I'm going to start to transition now to our next major trend, and to do that, I'm going to close out with an answer to one other question that's come in, and it's around, have we seen agile ways of working in research organizations? And that's a great question, by the way, and I appreciate that coming in. That probably that topic alone could probably take an entire webinar. So let me make just a quick comment about that, and if we want to follow up offline further, we can. We see agile ways of working being a great fit in most research-based organizations. Now, there are aspects of the research and development process where agile may not be the best fit, where you have to follow very rigid standards and protocols. But when you're in sort of the upfront generation phase of research, agile is a great way to accelerate, where possible, some of your investigation and option generation and narrowing down. And so we can talk more about that, but there would have to be some adaptations to traditional agile for research and development, but by its nature, bringing the right people together across an organization in concentrated bursts to work on innovative solutions would certainly be a decent fit with research type organizations. So thank you for the questions. Let me jump now to sort of the next big theme that we're seeing. Most of you who are dialing in may know that a couple of years ago we wrote a book called Mastering the Cube, and the imagery of a Rubik's Cube is used to help us remember and think about the aspects of an organization. So, for example, one side of the cube might represent the work of an organization. Another side might represent the structure and governance of an organization. Later in our discussion today, we'll dive into that in more depth. But each side of the cube represents an aspect of an organization. Now we hit this topic of digital transformation, and here's why this is interesting. And I've just used the Rubik's Cube and how quickly it can be solved as an illustration here to show why digital transformation is such an important topic. The world record for a human being, and obviously you can see it's a young man here, to solve the Rubik's Cube is just under 5 seconds. It's pretty miraculous to watch these kids work on solving this and do it in such a short amount of time. But what has started to stand out to me is that there are now robots, machines, that can solve the Rubik's Cube as well. And the world record for a machine to solve it now is just over 1 second. And that's remarkable. And when you start to, both are extremely fast. I can barely, look at a cube and even know what to do with it, let alone solve it in less than 5 seconds. But the fact that a machine at this point can solve the cube in about 20% of the time that a human being can solve it in gives you an idea of why digital transformation is hitting our world and our businesses by storm. And so this is going to be a topic that I think is going to, sort of be around for some time. And so we're going to spend just a minute kind of delving into this particular topic. Now, as we think about digital transformation, there's a couple of principles that I think are important to keep in mind. First is any transformation at all in an organization, digital or otherwise, has to start in the marketplace with what are the needs of the customer and what are you trying to do strategically to win. This should not start with what technology do we have or what solution, are we interested in providing. It has to start in the marketplace with the needs of the market and the customer. Second principle, digital transformation should truly transform a business and a business model and ultimately the experience of the customer, not just streamline work. If all we want to do is automate something, then I would argue that that generally is not a full and a true digital transformation. What we're looking here is for a way for the human and the technical elements to come together in an intuitive and insightful way that can really shape a new experience or way of generating and creating value for customers, not just can we automate certain tasks. Now, there's a place for automation, so I'm not knocking that as a possible strategy. But for us, as we think about digital transformation, it's a bit more than just automating work. And then the third principle is, whenever we're looking at a digital transformation or a transformation, frankly, of any sort, digital or otherwise, we're really looking at how do we redefine the role of people and talent and not just eliminate jobs and headcount. Because there still need to be people with specialized skills making key decisions, inventing, creating, working in the system that we are working to design. If all we're trying to do, as I mentioned a minute ago, is automate and take headcount out, that for me is not really a transformation nor a digital transformation. And so that's for me some of the foundational principles. Now, as I mentioned a minute ago, I wanted to highlight the cube that we use to help us think about the organizational systems. You can see the 6 sides of the cube. And of course, the key is you don't get credit if all you do is solve one side of the cube. You have to make sure all sides of the cube are well aligned, not just to the strategy of the organization, but to one another. And this is why in the past, all of us have probably experienced situations where an organization where you have a situation where a practice or a system or a structure or a work process is implemented and it's deemed to be a best practice, but that best practice doesn't work really well with everything else going on in the organization. I'm reminded of a situation where uh, I called into a call center one time, and I was someone picked up the phone and they asked me right away if they could put me on hold, and of course that irritated me a little bit. But when they finally came back on, I said, why did you put me on hold? And they said, well, I was finishing up my previous call, and the automated dialer, directed your call to me before I was able to switch my system and help you. And as I reflected on that situation, it told me that someone well-intended, worked on a system that would drive productivity in a call center environment, but it was not well connected to the overall experience that the call center agent and ultimately me as the customer needed to have. And so what it led to are these situations where a person would call and then be placed immediately on hold. And so for me, that's an example of where the experience doesn't match exactly the kind of outcome that we're looking for. Now, the reason I've highlighted work here is that if we really want to redesign in a digital way the experience, we have to start with the work. We have to understand how is that work delivering strategy and delivering value to the customer, and what are the elements in the work system beyond just the work processes and the procedures, but also the equipment, the tools, the technologies, and even the facilities that all come together to contribute to the delivery of the work that is necessary to deliver strategy. Now, as we break this down a little bit further, I was reflecting back, as I travel quite a bit in my work, to an experience that not too many years ago I had on a regular basis. I remember, putting up my umbrella or standing there with rain pouring down out on the street, hoping to hail a cab. Once I was in the cab, I was presented with a meter that would, continually churn, and I could watch incrementally the painful increase in the cost with, certain extras being added along the way. But I never quite knew where the fare would end up, and I kept hoping, hurry up, get there so that the fare can stop growing. And then, of course, when I got there, I often had to dig through my wallet or even my briefcase to find cash if they wouldn't take a credit card. And, there was a pretty, tedious experience historically with taxi cabs. And then along came a new way of doing this. And this is why the ride-sharing programs like Uber and Lyft and others have come on and, frankly, transformed this entire industry because the experience is different. I can stand inside out of the rain and notify a car or a driver that I need them to come pick me up, and they can come pretty close to where I'm at. I know ahead of time usually what the fare is going to be. There's no surprises there. It's not, if we get stuck in traffic, all of a sudden that meter just keeps growing. And when I'm finished, I don't have to fish around in this car, digging out my wallet or pulling out cash. I just get out because the app takes care of all of those inconveniences. And for me, this example is a great example of a digital transformation. Now, obviously, there are winners and losers in this space, but this is obviously an example of where digital transformation has radically changed the way we think about organizations. And so before we leave this topic, for me, organization design then is a discipline, and it is something that we're going to have to help our organizations do, is to look at the organizational systems. So I'm going to go back a page here. And we have to help them think about not just the system or technology, but also how does that impact roles and jobs? How does that impact the metrics that we track? How does that impact the talent that we need to have or the rewards that we're going to use to drive certain behaviors? How are we going to continually modify and improve our organization? And ultimately, what's that going to mean for the culture? All of those, for me, are organization design implications of a digital transformation. And as our organizations are asking the questions, how do we radically transform the way we go to market, whether we're trying to, in essence, obsolete ourselves or enter a market and radically change it, we have to be willing and able to ask all of those kinds of design questions. So with that, I'm going to shift now to sort of our third major theme, and I do see that we've got some questions coming through, so in a minute I'll peruse those in a little bit more detail and try to respond to some of those. Our last big theme that we're seeing is this notion that organizations are increasingly becoming networks or webs of capability and of people and of technology. And in essence, we're beginning to think of organizations really as platforms that can create value. Um, Kind of in an old way, we would think about an organization as being, the entity that owned the assets and the people and the equipment that would produce value across an entire value chain. In fact, it was once very desirable for an organization to fully control vertically and horizontally almost their entire value chain. And what we've seen, obviously, over the past decades is a continual movement away from that. But we've reached a tipping point now where technology has enabled it, and the ways of working, we're seeing it now through the gig economy, where the way in which organizations generate value is not by controlling everything or owning everything, but in networking it together in value-producing ways. And this is what, for org designers, is really cool, because now we're not just doing organization design for, sort of the fixed finite set of assets and resources that an organization controls, but we're now looking horizontally across the system, the ecosystem that's being created, and figuring out how do we design for the governance that's necessary in work and in resources that we don't directly control as an organization. And so this poses a lot of new and interesting challenges for organization designers. Now, just to kind of break this down into a little bit more of a mechanical view here, let me kind of highlight that there's different kinds of networks that can get produced or that evolve. Some of them are one-directional networks. And one-directional networks, allow us to basically push something out. So if we're the blue dot, we're pushing something out. We're selling something, we're training something, we're distributing our product. On the flip side, we can also receive, right? We can go outside and we can find someone and they can just give us what they have. We can buy it, we can listen to it, and so forth. We can source it, and so on. And what we're starting to see, of course, is that these models of give and take are starting to become more complex. So sometimes they can become bidirectional, where there's an exchange. You do this, and I'll do that. We'll consult together with one another. You might have some insights or some input that can help inform the way I do and think about work in my organization. It can go even further than that, to where we now start to see different people in the same ecosystem working together, but still being sort of largely controlled for the purposes of our own organization. And so we're trying to figure out how to govern and integrate this entire network and in essence, sort of get it to do what we need it to do. And in sort of the final and most evolved state, what we're seeing is that our sort of place in the entire ecosystem becomes somewhat, equal to or just a part of the overall system and ecosystem, where people are coming together to collaborate and partner, in ways that generates value for lots of parties in the system in a variety of different ways. And this is obviously, these different scenarios create a lot of new opportunities for organization designers, and also implications for talent, for resource allocation, for acquisition of assets, and so a lot of different things. What I'd like to do is sort of highlight some of the questions that these kind of evolving organizational forms begin to pose for organizations and for leaders. Move forward here. The first set of questions are things like this. How do you become more flexible in your staffing? So if there are times when in certain places or in certain locations I don't own and control the staff, then how do I have more flexible options? Another question is, how do I leverage people that I'm engaged with? call them my followers, or the communities of expertise or practice that exist out there. What are some of the models or analytics that can help shape decision making? We're seeing this a lot with machine learning, artificial intelligence. We see it very practically today as we're now in the holiday season when retailers are looking to try to capture every dollar they can as we buy on Black Friday and Cyber Monday, and as we head into the holiday season. They're using very sophisticated models now to predict the kinds of things that we may purchase, when we may purchase them, what kind of offers and so forth can come to us. The interesting thing is, I read an article the other day that said right now customers feel like only 40% of the outreach that retailers make to them really hit the mark, which means that they're getting presented with offers and things that a customer is saying, I don't care about this. I don't know why I'm getting this. This is just junk mail to me. And that's because we have room to continue to grow and evolve those models and those analytics. But those are becoming increasingly important to where I believe one day they'll be pretty precise and they'll be able to really almost know before we know what we're thinking, what we want to buy, when we want to buy it, where we want to buy it. Another question is, how can we make operations infinitely scalable? We're seeing this now with places like Microsoft's Azure, cloud computing, with AWS, Amazon's web services, where in essence, businesses can just lease and rent space and capability in the cloud, and their business can be as large or as small as it needs to be, and they don't have to go and build their own data centers, but they're able to almost instantaneously increase or decrease the capability and scale that they need. And that's the kind of flexibility organizations are going to need going forward. Now, that poses great security issues and other kinds of things, but it's a question that are key design considerations. And then obviously is, how do we attract resources and attention? In a world where people are working more and more on gigs, projects, short, discrete pieces of work, how do we draw attention to the things that matter for us? Now, those are some of the external questions. There's some additional questions that I believe are more focused internally to the organization that impact our design decisions, such as how do we enable efficient interfaces? Right now, we get together in a room, in a conference room, which there are never enough of, and we have a meeting. Well, are there more efficient ways to facilitate interaction, resource sharing, decision making? How is information available to inform decisions and drive behaviors? As more and more information is democratized and we can get it available on mobile devices and we can get it real time, how does that shape the way we make decisions and how we drive behavior? How is entrepreneurialism encouraged and rewarded in organizations? In the past, a lot of it was, here's the plan, please follow and execute the plan. Thank you for thinking, but please do that on your own time. We're interested in executing our plan. But now we're in a world where there are organizations out there that will say to their employees, you don't have a job description, there's no management hierarchy, you just find out what projects we're working on that you have interest in, and please go work on those. And if they generate value, then you'll be rewarded for that. Wow. That's a really different way of engaging as an employee, and it's a different way of focusing people on work. That wouldn't work in every organization, but those are some of the questions that are hitting us. How are teams encouraged to form just in time to address certain issues? This kind of harkens back to our Agile discussion. And then how can technology be used to enable work and interactions? And so these are some of the key design questions that come out of this whole platform and virtual networked organizations trend that I think we're seeing out there. As I've mentioned, and I believe I've seen a question come in on this, experienced org designers know that organization design is a multi-dimensional problem. It's frankly what keeps a lot of us in this field, is because if it was just a one-dimensional thing, like figure out an org chart, we wouldn't be really interested in that, because you could probably figure that out pretty simply. But when you start to pull all these elements together, you now really come up with a pretty interesting and complex puzzle that can sort of be compelling and interesting. And the key, of course, is to ensure there's full alignment throughout. So we might have to think differently about the tools that we have in our toolkits, because the way that we get a formal structure and historical spans and layers and some of the things that historically we think about around organization design may or may not always fit the kinds of trends we're seeing. I believe all of these system elements will still be very relevant in the year to come and in the years to come, because there's still work to be done. Whether the experience is transforming digitally, there's still work to be done. And so that will always be a design consideration. Will we always want a way to measure and account for how we're performing? Of course we will. Now, whether we do that on a whiteboard on a factory line or whether we do that through a mobile app, those things are, of course, going to change. But those systems are always going to be key and relevant design considerations. Now, as I mentioned a month ago, I was at the conference board, and one of the most compelling conversations we had, and it sort of hit me how important this conversation was, is the idea that organization design thinking really is a series of events. And I want to kind of talk about this because if we don't think about organization design as happening at different levels, then we may not always be able to respond to some of these trends. So let me walk you through kind of the framework we use and highlight some of the different levels of design. So in a perfect world, we look at our results as an organization and we understand how we're performing today. On the flip side, we go to the market and we look at the environment and we ask ourselves, what's going on in the market that matters, what's shifting and changing. And then we begin as an organization to make strategic choices. And for me, this is sort of the first level of design. Now, a lot of people might say, well, that's not organization design, that's strategy. For me, this is the anchor. This is what cements any other design choice we make. And so in my mind, it is organization design, because if I don't know what that anchor is, it's really hard to make any other good design choices. And so that's sort of the first set of design choices for me, is to understand the strategy, how we're going to win in the marketplace, how we want to allocate resources, how we're going to differentiate, and what trade-offs we're going to make. The next level of design is the level of design that starts to define and set up and enhance the organizational capabilities that will allow us to win. We often refer to this as macro level design. And then you get down to a level of design that gets to the more tactical and operational choices of the organization. What's a job description? What are the work processes? What's the incentive plan? And so forth. And as I mentioned, strategy is really about understanding the implications of strategy. It's strategy clarification. Then there's a macro level of alignment. Then there's a micro level of alignment. And this is where the cube comes in, because as we start to make those choices, particularly at the macro level and at the micro level, we start to look systemically at all the features in the organization that might have to evolve. So let me use Agile as an example for a moment. We talked about Agile back a few minutes ago, and we talked about how organizations are wanting to adopt that as a way of changing their culture in their organization. So here's the interesting thing. If I want to adopt Agile in my software development part of the organization in IT, it's pretty much a micro level issue. I figure out, well, what's the work to be done? How will I structure my development teams? How am I going to measure and track those teams? What kind of talent do I need? Do I need to get a few Scrum Masters that can help facilitate those? Do I need to train the IT leaders to be effective product managers, or product owners in the Agile parlance, and so forth? And I start to train and teach and reinforce this whole way of working within IT. To me, that's largely a micro level set of choices. But when an organization comes along and says, you know what, we want to, across our entire enterprise, start to work and operate more agilely. One of the largest financial services companies in the world is working on the topic of agility right now. Well, that's a pretty big idea. It's more than setting up some agile teams. in their IT area. It's about how they think about it, how they think about decision making. So in my mind, we've now shifted the decision making from the micro level of design to the macro level of design. How do we think about work across an enterprise? How do we govern it? So this may be a little less about roles and responsibilities and more about how do we make decisions? Who has decision rights? How do we encourage decisions to be made in a cross-functional way? And those kind of macro level questions now become relevant when the agile movement moves from just software development into more of an enterprise way of working and a cultural movement. And so I hope this discussion of thinking about organization design and levels is helpful because it's important that as we look to the future and we think about these trends, that we don't get stuck trying to do, let's say, a micro level of design and miss the important design considerations that have to be made at more strategic levels, like at a macro level or even at a strategy clarification level. This is why, if I go back to that example I told on the call center, where when I called in, I was put immediately on hold, it's because at a micro level, two different groups made some decisions about how they wanted to handle a work process and then a system that were not well aligned because they hadn't moved to a more macro level and asked the question, what experience do we want to create for the customer? And how do we build into that experience a means of ensuring productivity and accountability for our workers? Interesting macro question. Someone should have asked that. But if we continue down a digital transformation journey in a similar way, we're going to end up with all sorts of misalignments throughout our organizations that are technologically enabled but are completely frustrating for customers. And that's why this issue of different levels of design is important. Now, I know some are probably asking, well, what really falls in each of these 6 sides of the cube? I'm going to very quickly kind of highlight the core questions that we're trying to answer in each, because these are the kinds of questions that as I look to the design situations that I'm confronted with our clients, that we are trying to answer, such as from a work perspective, how should processes be aligned to deliver value? What tools and techniques are going to enable that performance? What structure and linkages will enable delivery? How can we measure quality and quantity? What talent is needed and how do we incent performance? How do we ensure continued value is returned to the business? And how do we make sure the culture is successful in enabling what we're trying to do in the marketplace? See, those questions are fundamental design questions that are constantly, I think, should be on the minds of our leaders. One of the most important building blocks that we talk about in our book is what we call design fluidly. And what this concept is about the fact that organization design and alignment is not an episodic event. And as I think about these trends that we've been talking about, agile ways of working, digital transformation, and better leveraging and designing for networked, platform-based organizations, if you don't design fluidly in a somewhat continual way, every design you create will have a shelf life of a few days or weeks because something's changing. And when that change happens, if your system is so rigid or so slow to evolve, it's not going to be effective. And so what we're suggesting here is that in a sense, leaders become much better at looking constantly and continually at their organization and asking the questions around the cube at the different levels of design so that they can ensure that their organization is keeping up with these kinds of trends. So if I kind of bring this home in kind of a nutshell, as strategy changes, that forces the capabilities, the macro level design choices to change, which then is going to force changes at a micro level, at a detailed level of how the organization operates. And so because these things are constantly changing, we're constantly in a mode of designing fluidly. So as an organization decides we're going to undertake some kind of digital transformation of our customer experience, Now I've got a ripple effect through all levels of design, and I use the cube as a way to begin to pose the right questions and frame the right issues so that we ensure that we don't end up with misalignments between the caller calling in and waiting on hold while someone's finishing up a job because two different parts of the system weren't designed together. Now, I'm going to advance a page here because I always like it when folks take a few minutes and kind of reflect on what we've been talking about. I hope you'll take a minute as we wrap things up and move to Q&A at this point. What are some of the trends impacting your industry and organization? What are some of the design challenges or opportunities that these trends are presenting for you? And how are you mobilizing to sort of rethink your organization, how it works, and how it delivers value? So I encourage you to kind of reflect on those. And now I'm going to turn to some of the other questions that came in. And there's quite a few here, so I'm going to just do my best to kind of click through these and give quick responses to all of them. One of the questions back on Agile was around whether or not lean principles apply. And so the short answer is yes, some of them absolutely can. There's a whole body of lean out there that really fits nicely with Agile because lean is about taking waste out, making things simpler, and about focusing on the value added and creating activities. And Agile is, in a sense, trying to eliminate as much as possible superfluous and extra things that are sort of in the way so we can get to things of real value. So yeah, there's definitely a connection there. Let's see here. So, great question about Agile again. How does that work in a global conglomerate? Well, obviously, ways of working and cultures can be quite different as you move to different parts of the world. So, as with any company-wide cultural movement, one of the questions that obviously has to be asked is a question of fit. How well will Agile ways of working fit in Asia or in Latin America? They might work great. They might not, given certain hierarchical frameworks or cultural frameworks. And so rather than trying to roll out a culture change as if it's a program, I would rather think about Agile from a principles perspective and think about how those principles might apply uniquely throughout an organization. And that's some of the nuanced, sophisticated work that I think you have to do if you're really going to roll something out from a cultural perspective through your organization. You have to examine those other design choices very carefully. Next question. What about Agile and very complex or capital-intensive projects? Yes, certainly Agile is a methodology that allows for, I'm going to call it a little bit more freewheeling, quick action. It's great in the technology space for sure because we're used to, as consumers and even as business or enterprise consumers, getting products, frankly, out of software that we know are not perfect. And, they'll improve over time. And we're comfortable with that. You don't want that same kind of, this airplane might fly or it might not kind of approach when you're designing something like an aircraft. And so you do have to be selective. But remember, if you go back to the roots of Agile, Agile's based on some very basic principles. One of them is, for example, that markets and environments are constantly changing. So whether you're designing an airplane or whether you're designing a beta version of a software with very different stakes for the end user, markets are changing. And because of that, whether you're designing one or the other, you do have to factor those in. So go back if you're in an industry or you're working in a business that you feel like, well, gosh, maybe Agile really doesn't apply. And ask yourself the question, how would the principles of Agile, they're very core based principles like the one I just illustrated, how would they apply in our environment? Look, just because I've highlighted Agile ways of working as a trend we're seeing does not imply that that trend will work in every situation or for every organization. I'm reminded about this story a lot because back in pre-2001 in the United States, when a passenger wanted to fly on Southwest Airlines, they would get a plastic boarding card that had a number on it, and they'd go to the gate, and when their number was called, they'd turn it in. And it was plastic, and it could be reused for the next set of passengers boarding the next flight. It was as archaic a system as you could think of for, boarding an airplane, but it was very, very effective. And it was only after 9/11 when we needed to match passenger identities and check baggage and things like that that we really had to get much more sophisticated. And what was interesting is, Southwest Airlines at the time was using that because it worked. They didn't at the time envision a need for a digital transformation. Now, they're one of the most digitally advanced companies, airlines now. But that's because times have changed. And so I always go back to that little example because 15 years ago, we boarded a Southwest Airlines flight with a plastic card. And, if that's sufficient for your organization, why change it? Just because we're all talking about digital transformation or agile ways of working doesn't mean that it has to apply for you. All right. I think we've hit most of the key questions. I know there are a few others here, but I think I've tried to scan them and most of the major ones. I really want to thank everyone for dialing in today. As we always try to do when we wrap these sessions up, we like to thank you by offering something. We've just pulled together a new white paper or executive guide, as we like to call them, which is a sort of an in-depth look at how to build an effective organization transformation COE. We're seeing across organizations everywhere different attempts to try to build internal capability, call it a center of expertise, around different dimensions of how organizations change. It might be change management, might be organization design, it might be talent management, might be process improvement, whatever it is. There's efforts to build and standardize and cement the capabilities of an organization to do this. And so we've seen some things that work and some things that don't. And so we've pulled together kind of a collection of our thinking around what are some of the winning practices of organization transformation COEs. So next week, Vonnie will be sending that out to those of you that participated. Hopefully you will find that to be an instructive piece as you're trying to build capabilities internally and be ready for the next year of organization design challenges. So with that, thank you for joining today. It's been a pleasure having you. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to answer any questions or engage with you further on any dialogue. Thank you very much.